in Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment, he has his main character, Raskolnikov, decides that he's going to commit a murder, and he has very good justification for the murder. And Dostoevsky is very good at this. He puts his characters into very, very difficult moral situations and gives them full justification for pursuing the pursuing the pathway that they're pursuing. And so Raskolnikov, he's broke and starving. He wants to go to law school. His sister's about to prostitute herself, roughly speaking, by marrying a guy that hates her, that she hates, and he has contempt for her, or at least acts in that manner. He's trying to rescue his mother as well, who's also in dire financial straits. He goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his meager possession so that he can continue to scrape by. And she has this niece, I believe it's her niece, that's not very bright, who she basically treats as a slave and is horrible to. And so the pawnbroker has this money. Raskolnikov is in dire need. He thinks, look, I'll just kill her, because why the hell not? I'll take her money. She's not doing any good with it anyways. I'll free her niece, who's just lurking as a slave. She's got all these other people tangled up in her pawnbroker schemes. All that'll happen is the world will be a better place. And the only thing that's holding me back is conventional moral cowardice. And, Dostoevsky has his character in Crime and Punishment go through days, hours and days and weeks of intense imagination about this, rationalization about this, trying to justify himself, placing himself outside the law so that he can perpetrate this act, and telling himself with all the best nihilistic arguments that the only possible thing that could be holding him back is an arbitrary sense of indoctrinated morality. And so Dostoevsky explores that. He does commit the murder, and then of course all hell breaks loose because things don't necessarily turn out the way that you want. He gets away with it, however. Well, he gets away with it technically because no one knows he did it. But he doesn't get away with it in relationship to his own conscience. And so the rest of the book explores that. Well, Dostoevsky, I believe it was in Crime and Punishment, although he makes the same point in many of his books, he makes a very fundamental point. And this is the kind of point that I think that people who haven't investigated these matters down this particular literary and philosophical pathway never grapple with. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see. To me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. the ethic that you think is normative, is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact midair without any foundational support. Now, you don't have to buy that, but if you're interested in the idea, then you can read Nietzsche, because that's what he was trying to sort out. And it wasn't only Nietzsche who came to that conclusion. It was many people have come to that conclusion, but I think the two who've outlined it most spectacularly were Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And Nietzsche is an unbelievably influential philosopher. You know, I don't think there was anyone that was more influential during the entire course of the 20th century, excepting a very, very tiny handful of other people, excepting the scientists. We won't bother with their discussion. You could put Marx in that category. You could put Freud in that category partly. But after that, the list starts to get a lot thinner, you know. So maybe there's 10 people up in that level. And Dostoevsky, of course, if anybody ever prepares a list of the top 10 greatest literary figures in the world, he would be in the top 10 list. You know, I think he's perhaps second to Shakespeare and maybe above Shakespeare in my estimation. So these aren't trivial people we're talking about, and they weren't dealing with trivial issues. Well, so then the question might be, what's at the bottom of the idea of a transcendent value? And I wanted to approach that staying out of the metaphysical domain as much as possible, because you can claim anything you want from a metaphysical perspective, and that's a big problem. And so people will say, well, why come up with the hypothesis of God, for example? God could be anything. There's a satire. The flying spaghetti monster, right, is a classic satirical representation of a deity that the atheist types use to buttress their arguments. And fair enough, you know, as a satirical idea, it's pretty damn funny. But there's things about this that aren't the least bit amusing. And the thing that's not amusing is, well, what, if anything, is our culture predicated on? Okay, so what happened? Well, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky put forth this set of propositions. And out of Dostoevsky's line of thinking, to some degree, grew Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn documented the absolute horrors of equity-predicated Soviet society, you know, and we don't learn about that, right? This I don't understand, is that what happened in the 20th century on the radical left end of the spectrum is not well documented. Students don't learn about it. Why the hell is that? We learn about World War II. We learn about what happened in the Holocaust, and fair enough, we absolutely should. But nobody knows. It's a mystery to everyone when I talk about what happened in the Soviet Union, and that's absolutely appalling. And that's to say nothing about what happened in China, which was equally horrible. The system didn't work. It was predicated on the wrong values, unless you think that that sort of thing means worked, you know, because you have to define that as well. But it collapsed under its own weight after it killed tens of millions of people. That doesn't really, and still, it's not like Russia has recovered. It doesn't seem to me like that's a very good definition of worked. Now, whatever we're doing in the West seems to work for all of its flaws. And the question is, are we just deceiving ourselves? Is it just arbitrary power politics and opinion? Or is there something at the bottom of it? So when Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, he believed that the Russians would have to return to Orthodox Christianity to find their pathway forward. And that's, of course, has made him into a reactionary in the eyes of many of his critics. But that is perhaps what is happening in Russia, although it's very difficult to tell because Putin also seems to be using his affiliation with the Orthodox Christian Church as a means to consolidate power. So the situation in Russia is unclear, but a religious revival, if that's happening in Russia, and perhaps it isn't, but if it is happening, is something that unfolds over decades and even centuries. So it's not an easy thing to evaluate when it first starts to happen. But Solzhenitsyn drew the same conclusions that Dostoevsky did fundamentally, not in exactly the same way, but very, very close. He believed, as far as I could tell, that unless people were willing to adhere to some sort of transcendent value, that they had no protection against pathological ideologies and no protection against the murderous impulses that came along with them. And I found his work I found his writing credible, powerful and credible. I don't know how you can read that book and not draw that kind of conclusion. I think people who criticize Solzhenitsyn have never read the damn book, because that book is it's like going into the ring with Muhammad Ali and being pummeled to death for half an hour. You know, you don't recover from it that easily. So then Jung branched off of Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche's idea was that people would have to create their own values, roughly speaking. And I think that's where Nietzsche is his weakest, because it isn't obvious to me that people can create their own values. And I think he fell into, and I don't want to be a casual critic of Nietzsche, because that's always dangerous, given that he probably had an IQ of 260. You know, I mean, he was way the hell out there in the stratosphere, and just when you think you've understood what he was talking about, you can be bloody well sure that you didn't. But it does seem to me, and he was running out of time. He died young, you know, and he was trying to solve this problem in a rush, I would say. And he hypothesized that people would have to become supermen, overmen, roughly speaking, in order to deal with the death of God. And that idea sort of branched off into Nazi propaganda, because that's in some sense what the Nazis were trying to do with their promotion of the perfect Aryan. You know, now it's a misappropriation of Nietzsche in my estimation. And it was partly because his sister, who is a perverse creature, what would you say, doctored his work in such a way so that it was more easily appropriated by the Nazis. But there is some danger in what he said too, because you know, the question is, well, if you're going to transform yourself into the giver of values, what stops you from inflating yourself into something like a demigod and just pronouncing what the values are going to be? So that's a problem. You know, you're going to replace tradition with yourself. Well, there's dangers in that, because there's nothing to keep you humble. That's the most appropriate objection. There's nothing to keep you humble. And those things can spiral out of control very rapidly. And they did, say, in the case of Hitler. I mean, it's easy to blame what happened in Germany on Hitler, but that's a big mistake, because it was a dialogue between Hitler and the German people. Right? Hitler didn't create himself. It was co-creation. He said things, people listened and told him back what to say. And then he said them and they listened and they told him back what to say. And it looped until he was the mouthpiece of their darkest desires. Now that's a game he was willing to play. But you can't think about that as, it isn't like Hitler created Nazi Germany. Hitler and the Germans co-created Nazi Germany. You know, when a leader gives articulation to the imagination of the population. That's what a leader does. And, you know, you could say that, well, maybe Hitler filtered what the Germans were telling him through a particular lens, because he had no shortage of resentment and desire for revenge in his own heart, you know. It's not like his life was a spectacular success before he became a political activist, and he was brutalized very badly in World War I, and he didn't get to pursue his primary dream, which was to be an art student in Vienna, and he had applied 3 times and got rejected all 3 times, and so he was bitter about that. He was basically living on the streets after World War I. He wasn't the world's happiest person, and I'm sure he carried a fair bit of resentment in his heart when he was in the trenches in World War I. In one experience that he had, all of his friends were killed by a mortar when he had wandered off to go do something else. So, you know, it's hard to even imagine what something like that would do to you. But I can tell you, when you're the only survivor out of 20 people, that's also going to give you an enhanced sense of your own specialness, because the alternative is just to think about how goddamn arbitrary the universe really is. this is a critical issue with regards to the shamanic transformation, is that people go through these terrible, terrible experiences, often drug-induced, by the way, with regards to the shaman. They usually use psychedelic chemicals of one form or another, often mushrooms, but they've come up with some very strange concoctions like ayahuasca down in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is an amazing substance. It's made out of the bark of one thing and another plant whose name I don't remember, that hardly even grow in the same place and that have to be cooked together in a special way. And no one has any idea how the damn Amazonians figured that out. It looks impossible. And if you ask them, they say, well, the plants told us how to do it, which, you know, Western people don't find very helpful. But the shamans are perfectly happy with that description. And ayahuasca takes them apart. And it does that in part because it affects the serotonergic system very, very powerfully, like all psychedelics do. And it transports them to another world. And that's how they interpret it. And what we know about psychedelics, you could put in a thimble and then throw the thimble away. We know nothing about psychedelics. There's new experiments going on at Johns Hopkins, for example, with psilocybin, which is part of this active chemical in magic mushrooms. Same structure, basically, as LSD and mescaline. And all the real psychedelics have basically the same structure, except the one that's derived from Amanita muscaria, which is called muscarinic acid. And it's its own weird thing that no one knows anything about. Anyways, they have profound neurochemical effects in very small doses. And the research group at Johns Hopkins has given psilocybin to research subjects, you know, purified psilocybin, because they started the new experimentation with psychedelics, and that's been banned for like 40 years, because psychedelics were so terrifying to our culture that we just put them away. It's like, whoa, no, we're not going there. And so even from a research perspective, and even though some of the psychedelics look very promising for the treatment of disorders like alcoholism, they recently used psilocybin to help people stop smoking down at Johns Hopkins, and I think they had an 80% success rate, which is just, like, that's just absolutely mind-boggling. And so, but if you give people psilocybin and they have a mystical experience, which is very common among people who take these sorts of chemicals, then their personality transforms permanently, such that 1 year later they're one standard deviation higher in openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And that seems to be a permanent transformation. And so that's really remarkable. And about 80% of the people who undergo the Johns Hopkins experiments report that the experience is like one of the two or three most important things that's ever happened to them. And so, well, that's something, you know. It's like, and then there's this guy named Rick Strassman down at, I think he was at the University of Texas, and he did experimentation with DMT. And DMT, dimethyltryptamine, if I remember correctly, is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. And you produce it in your brain. And it's in plants. It's like a very common chemical. But DMT is a weird hallucinogen because it has an extraordinarily short mechanism of action. It's like, and people who take it report that they're blasted out of their body, like out of a cannon, and then they go out somewhere and encounter beings of various sorts, and then 10 minutes later they're back. And virtually everyone reports that, which is really strange. And so Strassman was giving people DMT intravenously so that the trip would last longer. This was all you know, NIH-funded experimentation, all cleared with the relevant ethics boards, all conducted within the last 10 years. And he basically quit doing it because he was a pretty straight scientist. You know, he was measuring heart rate and pulse and all that sort of thing, trying to look at the physiology. And then the people he was giving these chemicals to kept coming back and telling him these crazy stories. And, well, it was too much for him, you know, and no wonder, you know, because they all said the same thing. And he'd say, well, that was a dream. And they'd say, no, and it was the most real thing that ever happened to me. And he'd say, well, you know, it's an archetypal experience. And they'd say, no, that was no archetypal experience. I went somewhere else and I saw things and I'm back. And, like, I don't care what you think. And, like, who the hell knows, right? Because it's all subjective. But the weird thing about it is that everyone's reporting the same thing. How the hell do you account for that? And then the shaman, you know, when they take these psychedelic chemicals, they basically say the same thing. They say, well, first of all, it more or less killed me. That's this. You know, I dissolved to a skeleton, and then I climbed the tree that unites heaven and earth, and I went into the realm of the gods, and they gave me some information, and I'm back. It's like, okay, well, you know, we don't really know what to make of that. And certainly that's what Eliade describes when he describes the shamanic procession, not the shamanic initiation. And You know, there's dissolution to a skeleton first, and then like a death, a symbolic death, or experienced as an actual death, and then bang, up into the realm of the gods, and then they come back. It's a very old idea. I mean, that's a medieval representation of the tunnel that people travel through at the end of their life to, you know, to find the light, which is a very common near-death experience report, and people don't have any idea what the hell to do with those reports, except say, well, it's the paroxysms of the dying brain, which you'd expect to be a hell of a lot more random, in my opinion. And the idea is there's a rebirth after that. And you know, here, this is the Scandinavian representation of that tree that unites earth with heaven. And so there's the Scandinavian representation. It has a snake, snakes down here eating it. And then that's the Amazonian representation. It's like, how the hell do you account for that? I mean, those pictures are so similar that it's beyond belief. Well, you know, we lived in trees for a long time. A long, 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 long time. Millions of years. And there were lots of snakes around them. And so the idea that reality is a tree that's surrounded by a snake that's in us, man. It's down there. It's deep. And there's something about it that's true. Now, not true like we normally think of truth, but true in an entirely different manner. So, and all that's pretty damn strange. We'll stop with this. My son drew this when he was 7 years old. It blew me away, man. I thought it was so cool, so I had it laminated. And so, here is what it is. On the right-hand side, that's order. It's like the yin-yang thing. That's order. Left side, chaos. Right? And those are all mushroom houses, which I thought was amazing. And then there's this river that runs right down the middle, like the line for order and chaos. And then there's this tree that goes up to heaven, and that's heaven up there. It's like there's St. Peter, there's the pearly gates, there's the clouds. It's like, he never went to church, you know. It's like, what the hell? And then there's a little bug there that goes up and down from heaven to earth. And that was him. And I thought, he had a very organized psyche, that kid. He was a very, very stable kid, and still is. And he drew that, and I thought, Jesus, that's just bloody well unbelievable. And I still think that when I look at it. And that's a great example of an archetype. Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon. He described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. And so it's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work, because, well, things have changed and you've learned something, and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was, and he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So one of the things I've noticed about Peter Pan type, I'm going to speak about men here because I've observed it more in men, is that they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think, or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? One of the things that I've suggested to my clients and to other people sometimes is that here's a weird little exercise that you can undertake, a little thought experiment. So you have your parents, and of course your parents have friends who are about their age, and maybe some of them are people you only know peripherally. And I might ask you, well, do you care more about what your parents think than you care about what these peripheral people who know your parents think? And then the answer to that is, well, of course. And then the question that arises out of that is, why? I mean, for someone else, your parents are the peripheral people, and their parents are central. Like, why is it logical that your parents make opinion makes any more difference to you than the opinion of some randomly selected people who are approximately that age? Why is it the case that you would consider that they would know more than someone else? I mean, I know they know you better, and fair enough, but that's not the point. And then another point there is that to the degree that your parents' opinion about you matters more than some randomly selected people of approximately the same age, Jung would say, well, you haven't exactly separated out the God image from your parents, and so you're still under that combination. It's like, it's a complicated thing to talk about, but think about the Harry Potter series. Harry has two sets of parents, right? He's got the Dursley parents, and then he's got these like magical parents that sort of float behind, and he should know the difference between them. They shouldn't be one and the same. They're not for him. And it's like, well, you have your parents and you have nature and culture as parents, and you shouldn't be thinking that your parents are nature and culture as well. They shouldn't have final dominion over you. It means that you're not an individual yet if that's the case. Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is, one of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point, you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain. Like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father, but that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly.